Handing over to you, Ernesto.
Okay. Good morning to those who are following us from Latin America and the Caribbean, and good afternoon to those who are following us from Europe. Welcome to the fifth panel of the webinar series called Multilateralism and Regionalism in Challenging Times, the relationship between Europe and Latin America and the Caribbean. I'll be conducting this webinar mostly in English. My name is Ernesto Jeger. I'm Senior Program Manager from the EU-LAC Foundation. And I would like to take this opportunity also to say that we have a simultaneous translation in Spanish and available just for those who participate through the Zoom platform. However, I remind you that the event is also being recorded and streamed on YouTube, which hopefully will not crash today like we had with Facebook and other social medias. But the series of these webinars have been also recorded and available, the previous series on the web pages of the Observatory of Regionalism. This series of webinars actually is co-organized by Unesp, Universidade Estadual de São Paulo in Brazil, the Observatory of Regionalism of the Postgraduate Program in International Relations Santiago Dantas from Unesp itself, from University of Campinas, Unicamp, and from the Catholic University of São Paulo, PUC. Also co-organized by the Faculty of Letters of the Coimbra University in Portugal and the Center of Governance Studies of the Catholic University of Louvain in Belgium. We have been following an interesting trajectory over the last Wednesdays, over the last 5 Wednesdays. We have begun with an opening session of this series of webinars discussing the prospects and perspectives for the bi-regional relations between the European Union and Latin America and Caribbean. The first panel then dealt with the democracy, the second with the environment and climate change. The third one dealt with trade and sustainability, and the fourth, last week, with human rights and multiculturalism. We end this series of webinars with today's webinar, which will focus on health and science and technology. In this panel, we hope that the 3 panelists will be able to address some of the following guiding questions. What is the state of health policy cooperation in the European Union? What have been the main actions and limitations of the Latin American Caribbean efforts in the health and sanitary area? How have Latin American Caribbean countries incorporated their regional efforts and decisions into each individual national context? And what have been the main problems in surpassing common health problems? What can EU-LAC cooperation do to surpass common challenges in health, science, and technology? Are there sleeping beauties in the current EU-LAC interactive frameworks that could be activated or enhanced in order to improve cooperation and effectiveness? So these questions, to answer these questions, we'll have the pleasure to count on the following distinguished panelists. We'll have today with us Professor Pia Riggirozzi. She is Professor of Global Politics at the University of Southampton in UK. Her research focuses on the political economy of development, human rights, and regional governance in Latin America. She is currently working on funded projects on gendered health inequalities, poverty, and the challenges of inclusive development in Latin America. Right after the intervention of Dr. Pia Riggirozzi, we will have the interventions of Dr. Maíra Fedatto, originally from Brazil. Maíra has 10 years experience working as a global health researcher with a PhD thesis written on the World Health Organizations and awarded by King's College London and University of São Paulo. She has also written her master's dissertation on international cooperation in health while at the University of Brasilia, and has a bachelor degree in journalism. As a health program evaluation specialist at KIDS, Maíra provides evidence-based research to support KIDS or projects in Latin America so we can collaborate to sustainable structural changes. And finally, we will have the participation of Mrs. Áine Markham. She was the former vice president of the International Board of Doctors Without Borders, or Médecins Sans Frontières. She holds expertise in humanitarian assistance, global health, research, policy, and possesses extensive experience in designing and delivering solutions to address public health challenges that affects underserved population throughout the world. With over 25 years experience in the humanitarian field, she has worked predominantly for Médecins Sans Frontières since 1994. Where she has held senior management positions both in the field and at the headquarters, including Director of Operations from 1999 to 2004. She has also worked as an independent consultant for national and international NGOs, foundations, and academic institutions, specializing in humanitarian global public health issues, including designing and implementation of research projects. Áine trained as a general and pediatric nurse in her home country, Ireland, and she holds a master's degree in public health and international politics. So now we have the pleasure to start this first round of interventions. So I'd like to pass the floor to Professor Pia Riggirozzi. Please.
Well, thank you very much for the introduction, for this invitation. Thank you, Ernesto, Jeger, Bruno, Luciano, Barbara, and everything. It's a real pleasure to be sharing this panel with all of you. And I hope I can keep up to the expectation. It's a really, really interesting panel, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. So what I would like to present today is 2 or 3 thoughts around the challenges that we see in regional governance in Latin America in relation to health, and what can we do in terms of expectations of EU-LAC cooperation. So that's kind of the context. We know that COVID in Latin America has revealed major challenges, 2 critical challenges at least. On the one hand, the very immediate challenge of health with very fragile health systems in very weak or weakened states, and a longer term challenge related to combating poverty, socioeconomic and gender inequalities, as well as job precariousness. All of these, of course, has serious implications for recovery within societies and across the region. But at the same time, COVID presents an era-defining challenge to regional governance. The region faces not just the health crisis, but also this health crisis hit a region that already has a migration crisis. And I want to bring these 2 crises together because I think these are intersecting crises that also define regional governance challenges that are very specific to Latin America. So Latin America has become the center of COVID, the epicenter of COVID-19, but since 2015 at least, there has been a major humanitarian crisis driven by mass forced migration from Venezuela and from Central America to other countries in the region. So migrants in particular are affected by the health crisis and by the economic consequences of the crisis, of the health crisis. So we know that they live in precarious housing, sanitary conditions, they don't have access to basic health services and social protection. For women and girls in particular, who represent nearly 50% of the migrants and refugees, this is very challenging. Even in normal times for them, accessing to healthcare is quite challenging. So the risks in the current intersecting crises is that they will face protracted displacement, ill health, poverty, and so on. So these are kind of the context crisis. So it's not just the health crisis, it's not just COVID, but it is the confluence of socioeconomic, health, and migration, humanitarian crisis that we need to consider. And these raise questions about responsibilities of governments individually and collective responsibility, so within nations, but also transborder cooperation. So my first point is that there is something of a paradox in both areas of policy, actually in Latin America, in both migration and health policies. The region has seen strong regional policy and action pre-crisis in both, actually. The region has been leading and pioneering policies in relation to the right of movement of people and also in relation to the right to health. So Latin America really has a long history and a strong trajectory in regional policies and regional cooperation in both areas. However, individually and regionally, the responses that we have seen in the context of COVID have been less than optimal, fragmented, and self-interested. In a way, there has been a conservative turn, a nationalistic turn that has affected cooperation and regional cooperation in particular. So there has been a clear inconsistency between the increase in regional and border problems and the decrease in concerted or shared responsibilities and responses. We know that many governments introduce emergency packages, wage subsidies, unemployment insurance, abandoned layoff, and other social policies that somehow reached unprotected populations, but we still have pockets of informal workers, migrants, particularly women migrants and girls who are really in the margins of these packages. And in any case, these packages tend to be short-term emergency responses, and we still have to see how transformative responses could act in terms of a sustainable approach to recovery. So this takes me to a second point, which is that recovery really needs a new social pact. Now, this has been something that CEPAL has been quite strong in terms of declaring the need of social pacts, not only at the regional level and national level, but also internationally. These social pacts will require a change in terms of distributive responsibilities based on regional collaboration, based on international cooperation, including better distribution of global financial support, cooperation for developing health programs, social protection, stronger health systems, technological infrastructures to increase equity of all sorts. So the third point that I want to make then is about how multilateralism and regionalism matter. The onset of COVID-19 has presented a real challenge like no other, really, to the regional organizations in Latin America. This has been a test, really, to their capacity, to the capacity of the regional bodies to coordinate responses to crises. But there's a legacy, hay equipo, as we say in Argentina. And I want to bring this to this third point. One lesson learned from previous experience of Mercosur, of Andean Community, of UNASUR, and of SICA, the Central American system of integration, is that regional organizations matter because at least three main roles. They provide normative and institutional resources for policy harmonization, for policy strengthening, for policy making. They can facilitate the mobilization of human, financial, and knowledge resources. These are not minor things for cooperation and for policy making. And they can foster networks of experts on subjects that are important to health systems, to health policies. We have seen this examples, particularly with the creation of the Institute of South American Governance in the context of UNASUR, which came to a halt, unfortunately, well before actually the crisis of COVID-19 hit the region. But the experience of ISACs, the Institute of South American Governance, and the fostering of networks of experts for health system support, for health system reforms, for social policies has been very important to the region. In situations of crisis, regional bodies can also help the continuity in the production and supply chain of critical medical products, of vaccines, of contraceptive methods and devices, immunization devices, food, etc. So these are real examples of why we need the regional organizations and support of the regional organizations' work. There are also very good examples of how regional organizations like Mercosur, UNASUR, and SICA developing institutionalized mechanisms for joint purchases of high-priced medicines. We have seen Mercosur and UNASUR working to buy as a cartel oncological medicines, HIV and hepatitis C medicines. This has been very effective in reducing prices or creating some sort of bank of prices that support countries to pay lower prices for medicines via these mechanisms. UNASUR has also presented a series of joint positioning in the World Health Assembly between 2010 and 2014. And this has been really important for the region. And in a way, this has been the possibility of the region reaching out for the ordinary people, really. That's the connection, providing what we call public goods. No? Health is a public good. In the context of COVID pandemic, this is slightly different. It's not that the region has not been active. The region has been active, but that has been related more to initiatives, individual initiatives, or disjointed between different regional initiatives. Overall, we do have a lack of leadership here, and that has been a problem. Limited possibilities of reaching concerted policies because of the lack of leadership to a great extent. It is possible, however, to observe some activities in different blocks in Latin America. I want to make the point of some of these initiatives. For example, the Central American Integration System that I mentioned, SICA, has strengthened some regional epidemiological surveillance strategies, have adopted some joint negotiation mechanisms for medicines. Mercosur has also mobilized some funds for emergency financial support for the purchase of supplies and testing kits for COVID. The great relevant example here is ECLAC, no? The Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, CEPAL, ECLAC. This is one of the main times, in a way, that ECLAC has stepped up to provide some sort of push for searching for leadership, in a way. So it's not necessarily direct leadership, but it's searching for leadership, and has supported a document led by Mexico, but prepared by the CELAC, the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States, a document that is titled Comprehensive Plan for Health Self-Sufficiency to Strengthen Capacities for Producing and Distributing Vaccines in CELAC countries. This is not a minor thing. The vaccine has been a major bottleneck for these countries, and within COVID-19, vaccination has been a major limiting factor in health equality, and a major limiting factor across societies trying to work together for the acquisition of vaccines. So this is not a minor thing. I think we have to pay particular attention to this and see how it evolves. So I'm going to finish with what can EU-LAC cooperation do to surpass these common challenges and this situation that Latin American countries face. So in the past, I mentioned that regional agreements have proven to be adequate instruments to protect health rights, to improve mobility, and pathways to residence for migrants, and the right to health in general. In fact, the right to health, or health as a right, really has been placed in the regional agenda because of regional organizations. So the great challenge here is to close the gap between what the regional organizations can do and what they actually do. So we need to reach somehow cooperation that help these organizations to close that gap, that credibility gap that in a way we see. We need cooperation agreements that support regional-led initiatives that can correct that restrictive turn that we witness in many Latin American countries. And regional-led initiatives could strengthen policy capacities, reform, redistribution of knowledge, material resources, and so on, that can actually have a long-lasting effect on health programs, on social protection, build initiatives and more inclusive and sustainable recovery. So I mentioned the joint presentation by CELAC and CEPAL as an opportunity. I think EU-LAC ministerial meetings is another opportunity. And I will also mention, which is not minor here, the work that IOM is doing with Mercosur through the Institute of Public Policies on Human Rights, which is really trying to develop regional cooperation to improve the human rights approach to migration policy, including health. So I think those are examples or manifestations, at least, of what regional organizations can do. But we still need to close that gap between what they can do and what they actually do. So I will leave it there, and I'm happy to continue later on in the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pia. It was a very interesting picture. I took note here about your three main points, the paradox between advanced policies that we have been witnessing in the region over the past years, but bad responses, which is also had to do with these gaps between within the regional bodies, between what they can do and what they are really doing. Then the social pact, a very important point within each country. We need to achieve this social pact, and the issue of the multilateralism matters. Regarding this specific last point, it's important to say that apart from this very interesting experiences from regional bodies that you mentioned, apart from the COVID, I mean, from other issues like antiretrovirals in HIV/AIDS or other health issues, within the COVID-19 perspective, I think one of the most important cases in terms of best responses was in Caribbean, within CARICOM. But why? Because CARICOM has a specificity that the other regional bodies you mentioned, they don't have. The fact that in CARICOM, they have a public health authority, which is named CARFA. CARFA was created in 2011 within the CARICOM to take forward all of the regional issues on health. That's why maybe Caribbean was better prepared to face the COVID-19 that other regional bodies like SICA, Andean Pact, or Mercosur. So this is one thing that's important, I think, to take in consideration, and how the other regional bodies could learn from the experience of CARICOM. And the other is, of course, you're right, there are plenty of opportunities for the cooperation, not just among these regional bodies within the region, but also with Europe, which is something that can be deepened, like, for instance, the cooperation on the access to vaccines within the COVAX mechanism, or even on science and technology, research on science and technology. So plenty of opportunities, and that's it. I think we can now hear from the other panelists their perspectives. But thank you very much, Pia. It was very important points that maybe we'll come back on the question and answer rounds. Now I would like to pass the floor to Professor Maíra Fedatto. Please, the floor is yours.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. First, I would like to say thank you for the invitation. For me, it's always a pleasure to have the opportunity to talk about global health. And I would like to start with the main lesson from COVID-19 pandemic in my perspective, that is, no one is safe until everyone is safe. And the big players of health governance must understand this. The pandemic has deepened global asymmetries and inequalities and has shown to the international community the necessity of solidarity and cooperation. While the availability of COVID-19 vaccines is a historic achievement due to the rapid development, I believe it's also a huge disappointment since the world has just missed the target set by the World Health Organization of vaccinating 10% of all people in all countries by the end of September. Actually, the WHO has set a global target of 70% of the population of all countries to be vaccinated by mid-2022. However, while the United Nations affirms that enough vaccines will be produced by the end of 2021 to cover this global target of 70%, most vaccines are being bought by wealthy countries, while other vaccine producing countries are restricting the export of doses so they can ensure that their own citizens get vaccinated first. And this approach has been named the vaccine nationalism, that, come on, does not have anything to do with cooperation and collaboration. And as of September 2021, just 3% of people in low-income countries have been vaccinated with at least one dose, compared to 6% in high-income countries. So vaccines that should be global public good so far have been following power and market competition instead of public health guidelines. Moreover, I think it's important to highlight as well that bilateral cooperation has surpassed both international and regional coordination, again, being motivated by political ties instead of health needs. And from a global health perspective, such approach in the face of a global pandemic is unstrategic, as the course and the consequence of the pandemic cannot be resolved or addressed without global cooperation. So in the context of a health crisis, regional and international coordination is extremely valuable for countries to leverage their capacities, complement actions, avoid duplicating efforts, and to learn from each other's experience. And while the European Union has coordinated a common European response to the pandemic, Latin American response has been unilateral and isolated, characterized by a very weak joint health agenda and minimum regional integration due to the politically vulnerable conditional, well-defined by political polarization, democratic backslide, and a lack of leadership in the region. And it's funny because Latin American countries traditionally have cooperated in health-related topics. It's worth remembering that the Pan-American Health Organization, PAHO, is the oldest regional organization in the world to address global health issues and has been a successful venue for cooperation and public health at the regional level. And Brazil used to be a strong leader in health-related topics as well, such as access to medicines. We were leader at the negotiations for the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, horizontal South-South cooperation. So when foreseeing the post-pandemic scenario, health cooperation will be fundamental to combat the spread of poverty and inequality, which the pandemic has increased, especially among individuals from Black and minority ethnic groups, poor socioeconomic backgrounds, urban and rurally deprived locations, and vulnerable groups of society. So how will COVID-19 transform global health and development assistance? This question brings us to a very important and neglected topic, that is the importance of strengthening health systems. The pandemic has pushed all health systems to their limits, exposing their gaps even in nations that once were lauded as gold standard for pandemic preparedness. The COVID-19 response requires testing, treatment, vaccines, and depends on healthcare infrastructure, workforce, and supplies to provide the much needed surge capacity within health systems. And the most important thing to keep in mind is that health systems are in the center of pandemic preparedness. There are several studies and recommendations on health system resilience, and there is an agreement that this concept not only relates to the health system's response to a sudden crisis, but to everyday challenges. And as COVID-19 has overwhelmed health systems worldwide, debates around resilience have become more urgent, considering that especially low and middle-income countries cannot rely on internal resources alone, and health system strengthening should be the driver of development assistance for health. However, how can we talk about resilient and robust health systems and pandemic preparedness when there's a projected shortfall of 18 million health workers by 2030? Mostly, of course, in low and lower middle-income countries, when at least half of the world's population currently lacks access to essential health service, and 1/3 of the world's people lack access to medicines, vaccines, diagnosis, and other essential medical products. In 2007, the World Health Organization published a framework for action called Everybody Business, strengthening health systems to improve health outcomes. 6 building blocks were defined as essential for strong health systems, as well as priorities for support. And they are service delivery that include packets, delivery models, infrastructure, management, safety, quality, demand for care. The second is health workforce, national workforce policies, investment plans, advocacy, norms, standards. The third is information. So facilitating population-based information and surveillance systems, global standard tools, medical products and vaccines and technology is the fourth, financing is the fifth, and leadership and governance is the sixth. So we can look in more detail in one of these building blocks during COVID-19 pandemic, that was the health workforce. And as I mentioned before, there is a health workforce crisis in course, which include low staffing levels and uneven geographic distribution. During the pandemic, we also observed shortage of proper personal protective equipment, PPE, limited testing capacity, inadequate training, social discrimination, and as cases surged globally, countries had to reallocate healthcare professionals, including primary care workers to emergency care, to intensive care units, and diagnosis and surveillance activities. Also, retired students or no practicing medical and paramedical professionals were asked to volunteer for healthcare tasks and increase the healthcare workforce available. Another building block that's very interesting to take a look is service delivery, because it has been directly threatened and compromised at all levels by the demands of a pandemic like COVID-19. And strengthening system capacity requires strong and well-funded primary health care, something that has been discussed since 1978 with Alma-Ata Declaration. And we need a skilled and protected workforce that ensure that high quality care is delivered in communities with a strong linkage to public health systems. Likewise, the long-term care sector and care for the elderly must be better integrated into health service delivery and into the public health functions as well. So the 6 building blocks, they weren't appointed by coincidence. And even though the health community is very aware of their importance, they have been largely ignored by big donors, including not only European countries such as the UK, France, Germany, but also non-governmental organizations as the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, Gavi Alliance, and others. And while historically health diplomacy has stayed on the sidelines of international relations, progressively, health has not only become a subject studied by international relations and political scientist experts, but also accrued a central role in foreign policy and agendas. So this can be seen through the upsurge of funds towards development assistance for health, which increased from less than 6 billion American dollars in the 90s to almost 23 billions nowadays. However, these funds are mostly distributed to disease-specific interventions, including STD control, which makes up almost a quarter of all funds in health sector, followed by reproductive health care and malaria control. And while these so-called vertical programs, in fact, have success in alleviating acute healthcare needs, these gains can only be sustained over the long term with stronger health systems. So having in mind the urgent focus on health system strengthening, several initiatives and recommendations were proposed to mitigate adverse effects of the increasingly complex funding flows and address health systems bottlenecks. However, unfortunately, it seems that global health governance has been just a recombination of old ideas since the Alma-Ata Declaration of Health for All in 1978, but has never been seriously adopted by big donors and wealthy governments. And we need this kind of commitment in a post-COVID-19 scenario. In less than 20 years, approximately 100 global health initiatives have been created to meet the Millennium Development Goals. Although these initiatives have leveraged and mobilized unprecedented levels of funding, they have focused mainly on specific diseases and target interventions, leaving health systems behind. So health systems need appropriate financing, not only to prepare for new pandemics that we know they are coming, but also to ensure that all people have access to health services they need, when and where they need them, without financial hardship, regardless of their ability to pay. And this is the foundation of universal health coverage. And investing in universal health coverage not only protects people from health threats, but also mitigates the social and economic burdens. France and Germany, for example, while invest more in service delivery and leadership and health governance, both part of the WHO recommended building blocks, is to invest little in health workforce and continue to invest heavily in disease-specific areas. So I'm going to use a lot of my time, but the final message I would really like to pass is that with 4.5 million global deaths and widespread social and economic costs, the pandemic must serve as a call for transformation and investment towards resilience and people-centeredness, beginning with health systems. Focus on vertical, disease-specific issues is unsustainable. We need to reshape global health by focusing on health system strengthening, and this should be the priority of the cooperation between the European Union and the Latin American, both very important players in the global health governance arena. Many thanks.
Ernesto, we cannot hear you.
Sorry, thank you very much, Maíra. Very interesting points that complements the perspectives that were mentioned before by Pia, which is interesting. I put here down some notes about, well, first we have this moral question, given the low levels of vaccinations in low-income countries. Some developed countries are now giving the third doses when the health organization, the World Health Organization, said that it's not necessary. So, and to compensate this moral questions, some of these rich countries are doing the vaccination diplomacy and distributing vaccines and other kind of medications when it's not sustainable. If you don't strengthen the health systems, you can have lots of vaccines, but you will not have the capacity or the ability to distribute them, to link the vaccines to other complementary efforts like diagnosis, tests, etc. Then it's a very interesting point. We, within the cooperation with donors, we have to focus beyond medication and vaccines and look at how we can put the preparedness or the strengthening of health systems at the core of the development cooperation assistance. And you gave us a nice suggestions in terms of building blocks for strengthening these health systems, especially the issues related to service delivery, to financing, and other infrastructure questions. So very important points. And now we would like to hear Áine Markham. Hope her microphone is working. Yes, perfect. So the floor is yours, Áine.
Okay, again, thank you so much for having me, and thanks to the two panelists, Pia and Maíra. Very interesting. So I'll try not to repeat what they said. I am going to speak on the importance of medical humanitarian action and health for the region of Latin America and the Caribbean, and pick up a bit on both what Pia and Maíra said in terms of health as a right and as essential to achieve a just society. So Latin America has frequent and is extremely vulnerable to multiple humanitarian disasters. So not least violence, what we call non-conflict violence, displacement of people, natural disasters, climate crisis, chronic and acute food security, epidemics, and health crisis. And they have a lot of exacerbating factors, such as poverty, socioeconomic inequality, political instability, again, extreme violence, a lot of climate shocks and extreme weather effects, definite and distinct pockets of invisible but extremely vulnerable populations, and a triple burden of disease, plus now the pandemic. I'm just going to touch on a few of them briefly. So from a perspective of climate shocks and natural disasters, there has been frequent and concurrent disasters, natural disasters ongoing, both from sort of what we would call sudden onset or slow onset. So earthquakes, floods, hurricanes, storms, forest fires, or then volcanic eruptions, heat waves, and these result in the loss of both human life and livestock, the degradation of land, drought, and eventually they contribute to the displacement of people. There are 8 countries that are considered in the top 25 most at risk of natural disasters in the region, many of which are in Central America and the Caribbean. And most people here will be knowledgeable about the phenomenon called El Niño and La Niña, which often results in health crisis, outbreaks of infectious diseases. It definitely aggravates food security, and it contributes to the displacement of people. And this is particularly evident in what is called the El Corredor Seco, or the dry corridor, which is found in the North Triangle in Central America, which is what we refer to Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador. There's also an increasing number of people, whereas before we used to define subsistence as subsistence farming, where about 40% of the Latin American and Caribbean population is dependent on subsistence farming. There's also a problem in terms of what we call ultra urbanization. So these mega urban metropolises that exist and are increasingly growing in Latin America, and which basically have created subsistence living within an urban setting. Unfortunately, Latin America is the most violent region in the planet at the present time. It's also the second most unequal region in the world. The violence stems from multiple sources and for multiple reasons, not least impunity, drug trafficking, gang warfare, etc. But we also have a multidimensional inequality, which is Latin America is the second most unequal region in the world. So the inequality greatly contributes to the violence. The violence disproportionately impacts vulnerable populations, and it is a major cause of displacement across Latin America and the Caribbean. It has already been mentioned by Pia, an example of which is, for example, Venezuela, where 5.6 million people have been forced into forced displacement, which is the largest displacement in the Western Hemisphere since the Second World War. The other area, this is why I specifically mentioned it before, is the Northern Triangle, where a lack of humanitarian and human protection, and honestly a level of extreme violence which is comparable to war zones and conflict areas in other parts of the world, is really increasing the number of both internally displaced people and displaced people that we're seeing. Last year alone, 1 million people that were reviewed in the Global Humanitarian Overview report basically came from the Northern Triangle in Central America, and the primary reason for displacement was violence. We know that COVID has aggravated this problem of displacement because due to border closures and in many cases suspension of services. So displaced people from across the region actually in some cases were really found themselves in extremely vulnerable situations, and in some cases had no choice but to return from where they came and into the insecurity and lack of protection that they found themselves in before. We also know that violence has a massive impact on the health of communities, both physically and mentally. And it has a serious impact on the overall well-being of any population. With regard to societal tensions, we know that there has been civil unrest and political instability across the region. Argentina, Bolivia, Chile, Brazil, Ecuador, Peru, Colombia have all witnessed mass protests in 2019. And COVID has increased tensions and resulted in the non-pharmaceutical interventions for the control of the pandemic have resulted in protests across the region. And I think the pandemic, as mentioned before by Pia and Maria, has really brought into a stark focus the inequalities within the region, and that these inequalities are not homogenous. A large informal labour market, so up to 50 to 70% in some countries, has meant that people are dependent on the population mobility to survive. So this is the subsistence living I just mentioned, and the COVID lockdowns resulted in hunger, eviction, pushed people into poverty, and it pushed people already in poverty into extreme poverty. Again, it disproportionately impacted what we call invisible or highly vulnerable populations. So native peoples, Afro-descendants, migrants or displaced persons, urban marginalized people, rurally isolated populations, women and girls, and LGBTQI populations. Important, it was already mentioned by Pia, important I think really to emphasize that gender matters and that the impact of the pandemic on women was extremely and particularly evident. 73% of all those employed in Latin American Caribbean healthcare sector are women, and not exclusive to Latin America, but there was an increased reporting of domestic violence across the region and also in Europe, but also specifically there is already a severe problem on domestic violence within Latin America, and that was aggravated by the pandemic and is aggravated by the pandemic. In terms of access to healthcare and the disease burden, there is a triple burden of disease. This is not, it is not just in Latin America, but it's definitely very pronounced in Latin America. This means that you have infectious diseases that are ongoing and endemic in the population, non-communicable diseases that are on the rise, and you still have nutritional disorders. Unfortunately, the region is known, and Pia and Mania already mentioned that, for fragmented healthcare services, highly variable healthcare infrastructure within and between countries, and very or inadequate access for the poor. It's also renowned for this two-tier system, which usually presents as a weak public health service and a highly prized privatization of healthcare services on the other side. There's an overly reliance on out-of-pocket expenditure for populations, meaning that 34% of all health expenditure in the region is actually people paying for healthcare. And this again tends to impact on more marginalized and more disadvantaged populations. Barriers to healthcare exist in both urban and rural settings, with the PAHO estimating that about 30% of the population cannot afford healthcare and 20% are excluded due to geographic factors. And again, data, so average data, so regional data, national data tend to hide vulnerable populations that are actually living health crises as we speak. I think it's important to mention that you have an important number of endemic infectious diseases, including what we call neglected tropical diseases, not least, for example, Chagas disease. And this is, again, highly related to poor dwellings and in particular native populations. You have another ongoing epidemic, that of HIV, and you have a lot of tuberculosis in the region. I already mentioned non-communicable diseases. Latin America really experienced a massive increase in non-communicable diseases over a much shorter time span than other regions in the world. And this has again increased the burden both on healthcare systems, but also on population and further impoverished households. Again, the problem of nutrition, you have stunting, wasting and overweight problems at all ages, but particularly in children. And it is disproportional in poor socioeconomic groups. Food security, I already mentioned this, but this is especially pronounced in parts of the Caribbean, not least Haiti. And I would just like to make a special mention of women's health, because I think gender really matters. There was an interruption of healthcare services, which could have important consequences for women's health over the coming years. And in humanitarian crisis in particular, it is really important to allow women to have agency over their bodies and to provide services that allow them to do that. And that would include sexual and gender-based violence services, menstrual hygiene management, and safe abortion care. These are essential in humanitarian crisis to allow for the dignity and agency of women. Just because Maria mentioned it, I wasn't going to, but I'm going to now. We call it the curse of the middle income countries. Regardless of whether you're in the lower or upper bracket, it's a terrible way to understand healthcare and to decide on access to healthcare products or tech transfer or any other health-related issue. And I think it is a common and really not useful technique or habit that we see across the global health world. In terms of the lack of impact of COVID, or the impact of COVID-19, a lot has been already mentioned. I think it's important to mention that Latin America and the Caribbean are only 5% of the world population, but they represent a quarter of all COVID deaths. There has been a lot written and said about the fact that health systems collapsed, hospitals were overwhelmed, ICU bed occupancy has spilled over 90%, oxygen was no longer available. As Maria just mentioned, they ran out of weren't able to access not just vaccines, not just oxygen, but also personal protective equipment, masks, and other healthcare products. Brazil was a particularly difficult case where they have the second highest death rate in the world. They had their COVID pandemic hugely impacted on disadvantaged, particularly native populations. There was a massive disinformation campaign and a science denial and a failure to really follow evidence-based practice in COVID management, which has really impacted the ability of populations to gain access to healthcare. And I think it's also important to note that once upon a time, not so long ago, Brazil did an amazing job and vaccinated 10 million people in one day against polio. So at the present time, they have given one dose of the vaccine to 12% of their population. Not to pick on Brazil, but just to give an example. Other impacts of COVID include really the interruption of normal services. Over 97% of the countries in Latin America and the Caribbean admitted that there was an interruption of services, and that included routine immunization. There's been a 10% drop in measles vaccination specifically in 8 countries, and that's indicative of potential further health crisis over the coming years. For the lack of vaccination in Latin America, and what that means, well, obviously it means that we cannot control the pandemic, that more avoidable deaths and long-term health consequences will happen, that there is a risk of more contagion and of new variants emerging. We are entrenching global inequality, so profit over people. It's interesting to note that out of all doses of COVID vaccinations given, 1 out of every 10 doses of vaccination was given in the European Union, compared to 1 in every 10 people in this region receiving their first vaccination dose. So it's a big inequality there. From a partnerships perspective of what the EU has and hasn't committed to do, I think it's interesting to note that they committed to sharing 200 million doses of COVID vaccination in 2021, but in October, which is where we are today, only 18 million doses have actually been put forward for donation. The EU has also not been pressuring vaccine manufacturers to transfer technology. They're not using this as a tool within their own bilateral purchasing negotiations. They did not support and were not proactive in supporting WHO initiatives, for example, CTAP and the mRNA Vaccine Technology Transfer Hub. And they're one of the main opponents to the TRIPS waiver, which was proposed by India and South Africa almost a year ago, and has been widely supported by Latin American and Caribbean countries. Also, just a small tidbit that PAHO has just announced that it's in discussion with Sinovac, but if people in Latin America are, as other people in the world have been, vaccinated with Sinovac, the EU will not recognize that these people are vaccinated because it doesn't recognize anything but full vaccination. So I think important to bear this in mind when we're talking about partnership. With regard to research, I just want to specifically mention it because I think we have demonstrated really that over the last 18 months that research and science has really demonstrated the utility and how important it is for the world. I get that is matched by the urgency to address misinformation and disinformation, but still research, particularly research in the region for priorities from the region, is really important, as much of the source of research funding comes from the US and European sources. I think it's important that Latin America identify not just globally interesting, but regional priorities that are really having health crisis impact on their populations, exploring whether or not recent scientific strides forward, such as mRNA vaccines and others, can actually help address pathways to eradication of diseases, for example, that exist maybe exclusively or certainly like neglected tropical diseases are very prevalent within pockets of the population in Latin America. There is a lot going on actually in Latin America at the moment around open science and people science, and I think this is really important, and it shows an opening up and a trying to breaking of the mold in terms of how we can get better access for people, not just to medicines, but to other healthcare products. And Latin America, of course, has to learn the same lessons as the EU, which Maria just mentioned, which is the boosting of regional capacity, not just for the vaccines, but in terms of level of not quite self-sufficiency, but definitely better capacity for medical equipment and health products. Finally, I'd just like to mention around humanitarian space and medical humanitarian action, because all of this, brings to mind the fact that there are ongoing humanitarian crises on a frequent basis, and concurrently, you can have more than one humanitarian crisis at the same time. And this is what's happening, that we have the pandemic. So we have a type of syndemic, what's called a syndemic situation. And Latin America has very much not just humanitarian values that that are known around the world, but they have developed their own sense of humanitarian values, and even though I agree with Pia that was not so evident in COVID-19 times, I would argue that it wasn't evident anywhere, not in Europe either. So the importance of solidarity, the importance of understanding that they cannot be indifferent, reciprocality, and also this type of comprehensive approach, but also an attempt at sustainability. And at the same time, there is this feeling that Latin America and Caribbean refuse to be seen as an area of humanitarian crisis, that humanitarian sort of is synonymous with something negative or bad. But actually, humanitarian action is definitely neither negative nor bad. It's actually a means with which we can address chronic and acute problems of populations that require immediate relief. So it's about population needs, and it requires a latitude of independence of action that is based on those population needs. So there's one of the things that's important around this is that one has to accept that means that humanitarian action is not necessarily a path to sustainability. It doesn't mean it's not, but it certainly shouldn't be considered as such, because it should be driven by what people need immediately. So a people-centered approach, taking and bearing in mind humanitarian dignity and allowing for a civil society action. And I think this is where organizations like EU-LAC are really important. So promoting and protecting and investing in humanitarian action, supporting solidarity and respecting humanity, dignity, respect, empathy, and solidarity for others. So always good to bear in mind that the existence of health facilities does not mean health for populations nor an access to healthcare. And in terms of where multinational cooperation and regional cooperation can be really strengthened as important, I think this is important around the protection of displaced populations and protection of other populations that are living in humanitarian crisis. This understanding of humanitarian space, not as something negative, but something essential to allow solidarity to happen and to support populations that are highly vulnerable and in need. The research area, thinking about priorities within Latin America and the Caribbean. I think the technology transfer that's ongoing at the present time, recently announced by PAHO that both Argentina and Brazil will make vaccines or mRNA vaccines, is great, but it can't be just limited at that. Ensuring that civil society has a voice and that voice gets heard, highlighting the needs of invisible populations, and again, just supporting solidarity and making sure that populations in need have that possibility to both be heard and to get assistance. Thank you.
Thank you, Áine. If I may, I will just summarize that, well, both, all of you mentioned that the COVID-19 actually emerged within a context in the region, Latin American Caribbean region, of multiple crises, social, economic, climate, and all of these crises, they are interlinked and they amplify the COVID crisis, the diseases, at the same time that makes the response to COVID more complex, more difficult. If you are in an environment of social, economic, and climate crisis, to tackle the pandemic, it's more difficult at the same time that it amplifies the consequences. So the importance of bear in mind all of these multi-dimension aspects of the region, the high inequality levels, the violence, the issues of nutrition, food security, also mentioned by others, by Pia and by Maíra before your intervention, the issue about migration, that also makes this scenario more complex. The issue of gender, of course, women in the front line of the pandemic, and especially questions regarding the governance, which has to do with Pia mentioned before, with Maíra mentioned before about strengthening the health systems, but also more broadly issues related to accountability, to corruption, that makes the response to COVID more difficult. And in terms of cooperation, there is space and room for, as I mentioned in my first intervention, research and science, technology transfer, and as mentioned now, Áine, also special regards to humanitarian assistance with this single flagship words: solidarity, reciprocity, dignity. So, and how this cooperation could also focus in supporting the civil society, if much of the governments in the region are now facing their difficulties and problems. So maybe there is a room and a space for civil society active participation on this recovery process, and the cooperation assistance should look at how to support the civil society. So now taking a look on the questions, let me see. First question. After seeing such uncoordinated responses to the health crisis during the pandemic, how could a closer relation between the EU and Latin American countries impact the multilateral efforts towards a global governance on health? There is this I could address to the three panelists, but there is one specific here to Pia. Is there any particular ISAGS practice from the past that would be crucial to promote regional health cooperation in times of COVID-19? I would like to start with Pia. So there is this global issue about the uncoordination responses to the health crisis and how the EU-LAC relationship could impact on multilateral efforts towards global governance on health, and this particular issue of ISAGS practice, and how do you see this could be crucial in promoting the regional cooperation on health?
Well, thank you very much. I also have to thank the previous two panelists, absolutely brilliant, informative, thought-provoking and accurate description of the many challenges and the intersecting challenges and the intersecting inequalities that go beyond the issue of health governance. And I think that's very important to highlight, because health is, as I might have said before, it's not just about intervention to patch up some disease-led problems. I think from both panelists, it became very clear that there are intersecting vulnerabilities and social determinants of health, which is in need to gather more attention from the international community if we are all serious about leaving no one behind and actually building back better and all those slogans that we are hearing these days. So in relation to some of the questions that were brought up in the chat, and also Ernesto placed a few points before as well, let me pick up on the institutionalization of health governance that we see. We actually see a very rich institutionalization of health governance across the region, including CARICOM as well, mentioned Ernesto before. So we have CELAC that approved strategic agendas with common health objectives, same with CARICOM, Mercosur, SICA, UNASUR created working groups, ministerial councils dedicated exclusively to health. The Mercosur has an ongoing working group, number 11, which is the meetings of the ministers of health and the subgroup of work that dedicates its work to health. The SICA is very important here, because COMISCA, in the same way that CARICOM, has a Council of Ministers of Health of Central America. And I think this is an interesting point to mention, because there's momentum going on, and momentum is growing in Central America and the Caribbean in relation to health, but we don't see anything beyond either declarations, surveillance, or vaccination. And of course, there is some flow of funding that goes to these countries, but they're not tackling the issues that we mentioned before, the intersecting vulnerabilities, the social determinants of health, and the things that are more structural that actually shape the long-term challenges here. So I think that tension between short-term responses and long-term responses still to be seen. I think the region has not garnered enough attention, global attention, beyond a very poorly implemented COVAX system. And now it faces real challenges that are likely to worsen the situation and pose a threat ahead in terms of recovery. There was a mentioning of what we can learn from previous institutionalization mechanisms that we have seen, like ISACS, the Institute of South American Health Governance, which was a pioneer effort pretty much led by el movimiento, emergentes, people that really work on the sanitaries movement, Brazil, and the health diplomacy that Brazil has developed for so long. All these kind of forces created this institution, which was some sort of think tank for health for the region, in the context of UNASUR, the Union of South American Nations. And what the ISACS was doing was actually developing an agenda on different aspects that focused on creating capacities for health reform, creating diplomatic capacities for negotiation in the World Health Organization, creating also specific programs for network resources across different aspects, like research on cancer, research on non-communicable diseases. So research of networks of experts was another major innovative, institutionalized contribution of ISACs. All that came to a halt, mainly for political reasons, but also for financial reasons. So the regional organizations are as good as what the governments provide for support in terms of resource and financial, and not just the governments. Going back to the global attention, if we are all serious about, if the CEPAL is serious, and if EU-LAC is serious, and all that kind of network of solidarity is serious about enhancing capacities for the region, the regional networks of researchers and experts and think tanks are a real focus of attention for these kind of initiatives. So I think that that's something that we can focus and a lesson learned from the past in a way. Now, finally, the region could have an EU-LAC could actually provide some opportunities to strategically focus on regional vaccine production, but not only, because as it was mentioned before, vaccine diplomacy is just one thing, but must not overshadow the real need in investment of primary care and other aspects of health services that are much in need in our countries. So, but nonetheless, regional vaccine production, manufacturing, technology transfer agreements, a long-term vision for supporting universities and research institutes, and so on, all those are open for new ways of cooperation and solidarity in terms of producing real local self-sufficient and regional capacity that can support real solutions and sustainable solutions. So I think that's kind of my first reaction to all these questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Pia. Before I pass to Maíra, I also like to add one question, because she mentioned the fact that PAHO, or OPAS in Spanish, is the oldest regional organization on health. There is one question that asks us about what can be the role of the OPAS during the pandemic. And so joining this question with the first one that I mentioned about the possibility of the EU-LAC countries to work together in strengthening the multilateral efforts. So please, Maíra, how do you see the role of the PAHO in the pandemic, or the WHO more broadly, and how the two regions could work together to strengthening these multilateral organizations?
Hi. So PAHO is at the same time part of WHO and an independent agency. So I can mention some actions that PAHO specifically did. For instance, a COVID-19 response fund to raise donations. Also reports on situation in the regions of the Americas, daily updates, and weekly press. Both are essential to risk communication, and risk communication is pointed by WHO as one of the pillars to pandemic preparedness, because people, the population, need to be aware of the situation to take the proper cautions when facing a pandemic. Also, September, 2 weeks ago, there was the Directing Council of PAHO, and was attended by health ministers, and 13 resolutions were approved that included increasing production capacity for essential medicines and health technologies, reinvigorating immunization as a public good for universal health, a strategy for building resilient health systems and post-COVID-19 pandemic recovery, a roadmap for digital transformation of health sector in the region of Americas, and as well, PAHO, in collaboration with Brazil and Argentina, has pointed both as regional hubs for the development and production of mRNA-based vaccines. Regarding WHO overall, I think there's a bit of misunderstanding of what is the role of WHO within a pandemic. So there is a lot of fingers pointed to WHO without properly understanding their role, WHO role, and especially WHO budget capacity to do what they have to do. But basically, WHO obligation and leadership is to do what they did. That is to do recommendations, to assist countries. WHO does not have the power to sanction any country, as it was that a lot of accusations that was been too easy on China, but there's no power given to WHO to do this kind of intervention, domestic intervention in a country. Regarding the relationship between European Union and Latin American countries and how this could improve global governance on health, I think that especially European countries, as I said, that until now totally focus their development assistance health for specific disease targets and interventions. I think it's time for building a health system strengthening approach. And although especially Germany has a better focus on service delivery, I think the most urgent call would be a resolution to improve, retain, and train health workforce, because we do not have health workers. Even if you look at Brazil, if you go to the capitals, if you the huge cities like São Paulo, Rio de Janeiro, you are going to have the ratio of 3 or 4 physicians per 1,000 population. That is comparable to very high income countries. On the other hand, if you go to the Northeast or the North Amazons, that the health system was completely overwhelmed. We do not have enough health workers. So for me, what the European Union in partnership with Latin American should do to improve global health governance is start this movement to finance health workforce, because it's essential. And we saw with COVID-19 outbreak that is the backbone of health systems and is the backbone of any pandemic preparedness. If we do not have health workers, we cannot have a proper response to any pandemic or even the daily challenges that all health systems have.
Thank you, Maíra. And now for Áine, if you wish to comment on what has been said, okay. But I would like to address to you specifically 2 questions. One, given that you have participated in our meeting on equal access to vaccines early this year, I would like to address to you one question about how to overcome unequal vaccines distributions. And the other questions that you also mentioned, the role of civil society in humanitarian assistance and in tackling this pandemic, if you could explore a little bit more about how the NGOs could work alongside the international organizations and multilaterals to combat and respond to the pandemic. So the floor is yours, Áine.
Okay, thank you. So I think first and foremost, and Pia and I already mentioned this, it's really important that Latin America and the Caribbean as a region sort of get their act together if we're going to have any chance at vaccine equity at all. The reason I say this is, as Maíra just mentioned as well, global health as it was understood has been shown through the COVID pandemic to be an empty promise. So now there is the possibility to redirect and to understand, like to redefine what global health should mean. And as has already been said, the fact that Europe and the United States of America and other parts of wealthier nations didn't necessarily do as well. Okay, they did better because they had more money and their health systems were more advanced, but they still didn't do very well. I mean, the United States is the largest mortality rate in the world. So from that perspective, I think it's important that Latin America finds some way to overcome the type of polarization that you're seeing within your political spectrum, and to find that means where there can be pressure brought to bear on the more polarized positioning or polarized political positioning to really give the region a cooperation and a cooperative outlook, because this is not something that individual states can do. And I hear, for example, going back to what Pia said about what regional and multilateral organizations can do and what they should do, I think is a sort of role that can be certainly taken under consideration. I think from lessons from the past, we should look at what HIV was able to achieve. I mean, at the time when HIV was exploding, Brazil was leading the way in terms of what was called the Doha Declaration, so which happened in 2001, and where it was agreed that, I'm trying to think of the exact wording, but basically it was agreed that WTO members could not be prevented from taking measures that would protect the health of their populations. And so I think this should be foremost in the minds of everybody when we're talking about COVID vaccines, but not only vaccines, also diagnostics and also treatments, which are now being rolled out. So it won't just be a vaccine issue, it'll be a treatment issue, it'll be a diagnostic issue as well. So bearing in mind that the bubble is bigger than just vaccines. And from the perspective of vaccines alone, I think that, if there is truly a cooperative state between different regions, then just insisting that the European Union abides by what they actually committed to do would be a wonderful first step. I don't want to get into whether COVAX works, doesn't work, can be saved or not, but I think it's really important that we bring pressure to bear. And again, that cannot be done by one nation alone. I think it has to be done by a region, and Latin America, in terms of, it has an important voice. It has an important voice both in academia and in research and in science and in global health. So I think they need to use that voice. And we need to think about compulsory licensing. We need to ensure that technological transfer is not just, for example, Pfizer or Sanofi making a new plant in somewhere else, but actual technological transfer, so that technology can be used for other reasons. And I think really Latin America needs to explore open science, which is really basically just non-patented science and people science, and encourage from grassroots up people to seek solutions and trying to use them to influence a new global health environment. So I think this is, for me, what is really, really important. And that, again, goes to your second question, which is about civil society. I think civil society is extremely active. It is very strong. It is not always listened to, and it is, in some cases, suppressed, and in some oppressed, we could say, in certain, again, this goes to sort of polarization of political perspective. I think societal tensions will continue to rise in the region. And so, again, it's really important that civil society and organizations like EU-LAC, here, for example, there could be a real role for organizations, multilateral organizations and regional organizations that have that good partnership between the European Union and, for example, or European countries and Latin America, whereby a support for ensuring the sort of prioritization towards hearing civil society, understanding, for example, that first responders are quite often the populations themselves, allowing people to have agency, and to basically have respect for that. I know in certain countries that's stronger than others in Latin America. I know Brazil has a particularly strong civil society, but civil society has, in many cases in Latin America, being co-opted as a privatization wing of the government. And I think it's time that they sort of step out of that and really try to create their own space. And I think multilateral organizations and support for that would be extremely useful given the sort of dynamics that we have in the region today. Thank you.
Thank you, Áine. Well, we are close to the end of this event. I would like to ask if some of you would like to make some final considerations. Then would like to pass the floor again in the same order. Pia, if you'd like to add some final remarks on the subject, you would have some more 3 minutes to do it.
Thank you very much. I think it became quite clear that we're talking about the intersecting crisis, and we are also talking about the need for collective responsibility. So when we talk about the role of regional organizations, I think it needs to be placed in the context, the debate needs to be placed in the context of collective responsibility. That goes back to the point of social pacts. So again, if CEPAL is serious about fostering the social pact, the social pact means responsibilities that include international financial institutions, for example. So there has been mentioning before of the gender aspect that is a bit of the elephant in the room because we haven't really developed that, but gender responses and COVID-19 related gender responses have been quite absent in many ways, except for some specific interventions. But I think given that UNDP has some sort of a tracker, a global gender response tracker, I think that's an element that could bring together with accountability and transparency the aspect of gender policies that all regional organizations and multilateral financial institutions and a multilateral cooperation need to bring to the center. We mentioned before other vulnerable populations, and they're vulnerable because they were made vulnerable. So in this intersecting crisis. So I think that's the final point that I wanted to bring, not to leave aside the important issue of gender sensitive policies here that have to be at the core of whatever social pact needs to be recreated at regional and international level. Thank you. Ernesto, your microphone, I think, is...
Sorry, Maíra would like to make your final remarks?
Yes, well, I think that current and future challenges, they're going to pass through multilateralism. Although the situation in Latin America, as the three of us has highlighted, it's very sensitive, it's very politically sensitive. It's a very important organization that can get some kind of consensus, and we cannot forget that the health assembly is coming in January. The reform of WHO, how WHO is financed, is very important as well. Focus on health system strengthening, remembering that nowadays we have 5 big donors in WHO that has almost hijacking the organization towards some specific disease like polio, that before the pandemic used to have 120% more funds than proposed, while health systems would have less than 6%, and health emergencies as well. So the solution is through multilateralism, is through academia pushing decision makers to change how health, global health, is being financed. I think we need to go from an amazing rhetoric to more practical actions in global health governance, because we have great rhetoric. We have huge acknowledgement of the importance of health systems, of inequalities in health, of the vast nationalism, but it's been very difficult to turn this rhetoric into actions. And I think COVID-19 may be the turning point to turn this into actions.
Thank you, Maíra. And please, Áine, we would like to hear your final remarks.
Yeah, so I'd like to go also with collective responsibility. I think it's the only type of collective action we've seen from across the world has been between India and South Africa about the TRIPS waiver. And they're not even in the same region. And they've been able to rally 120 countries to their cause. Here in Latin America and the Caribbean, you have numerous countries and territories that are already naturally bound together and who are interdependent on each other's healthcare, because it's not just social determinants of health, but the interdependence in terms of cross-border and the migration and displacement that really causes this interdependence in terms of the health of a population. I think this is important because right now, nobody is really, nowhere in the world do we see a real regional approach. What we see is really national vaccination approach, national approaches. Maria said it earlier on, but actually there is a very, very good pandemic handbook. We just didn't use it. So it exists. We know what to do when we get a pandemic, but for some reason, we decided with the greatest pandemic the world has ever seen that we weren't going to use it. So I think it's really important, and it would be really valuable for the world today if Latin America could genuinely get its act together, approach areas, rally support from other parts of the world, because I do think this idea of north-south has been dismantled and can be dismantled now. And this is the moment. Latin America has the capacity to do it, it has the intellectual knowledge to do it. It might need to do other things as well to improve. And yes, there's plenty of things it can do to improve, but to go from that wonderful rhetoric to those actions that Maria is talking about, using that gender lens, that and respecting vulnerable populations, I think that is the type of collective responsibility that we need to juxtaposition ourselves out of this, national vaccine approach, and to at least one area of the world saying, no, we're going to have a joint approach. And the last thing I would say is, please, respecting civil society and allowing humanitarian action, and not seeing humanitarian action as something that is negative or bad or part of development, but really as a means through which we can help populations. And if we were to solve, even if COVID, which now it looks very likely will be endemic, if we could at least bring the pandemic under control, that would give us one less problem to deal with. Thank you.
Thank you, Áine. This was a wonderful perspective on the health issues within our series of webinars on multilateralism. We get the consensus that regional and multilateral organizations matters, strong health systems matters, civil society, as you mentioned now, matters and has have a big role on this, and share and co-responsibility matters. I just would like to add that science matters. We have to put science closer to the policymakers, and indeed this webinar was a webinar dedicated to health and science and technology. So I would like to thank you all of your distinguished panelists, Pia Riggirozzi, Maíra, and Áine. We hope to see you soon in further events and initiatives. And would like to also mention to the public that are following us that this series of webinars have been recorded. All of the videos are now uploaded within the website of the Observatory of Regionalism. We will have the commitment to make some interviews to go deeper in depth, actually, on some of the issues that we have not been able to discuss within 1 hour and a half of webinars. So in a few weeks, we will have also a collections of interviews with selected panelists that will be also uploaded on the website. And all of the organizers of this event, the universities in Brazil, UNESP, the Observatory of Regionalism, the Coimbra, University of Coimbra, and the Catholic University of Louvain, and the EU-LAC Foundation, we have the commitment to make a publication. We hope to have a book with the main discussions that have been arising from these 6 events, this series of webinars. and make it available in digital format as well as on the respective websites of the co-organizing agencies. We also would like to mention that participants will be receiving soon a questionnaire by email to evaluate this series of webinars. For us, it's an important aspect. We need to constantly improve the quality of our activities. So please, when you receive this questionnaire, fill in and send us back. It will be important for us to as a feedback. And also, in a few weeks, we'll be sending the certificates for the participants of this series of webinars. We have this commitment to give to those who have been following the series sort of a certificate signed by all of the institutions that confirm your participation on that. So thank you very much again for panelists, for audience, and look forward to see you soon in our next events. And have a good continuation of the day for those in Latin America, and a good evening for those in Europe. Okay, thank you very much, and bye-bye.
Thank you very much to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye.